Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
So, all refreshed, all have a good cup of coffee, come on in. Come in, come in, come in, come in. Come sit down. Okay, so SuperOffice and Zapier integration. So this is, you've presumably been to the previous talk where they talked about all the wonderful things you can do with Zapier and all the wonderful things you can connect to. Now, this talk, I talk about how we actually built this thing and what it's doing behind the scenes. Apparently today is Programmers Day in China, so happy Programmers Day. It's the 10/24th. This is me. I'm here presenting. I did very little of the actual work. Kishti did most of the actual sort of managing and getting people to actually do the work. She has about 80 days left before she has to project manage a young human. So very young. So if you have feature requests or changes, you have 4 sprints left to get them in. And then in Sri Lanka, we have Kusala, who is one of the 2 developers, and Kiva. They are watching the live stream, I hope. Hello, guys. Good job. And in case you missed the first presentation, this is what Zapier is. It's a thing that sits in the middle and connects everything to everything else. And you know, there are 2 basic parts to sort of Zapier integration. We have triggers and actions. So the triggers, the thing on top. Oh, we went on that screen. It worked so well just a minute ago. No, it's, oh, there we go. Triggers, yeah, there we go. Trigger, and then actions are these things down here. So there's always one trigger that sort of kicks off the thing, and then you can have as many actions as you can afford to pay for. Triggers are event-based. This Zapier handles this in 2 different ways. You do webhooks, which is the way SuperOffice does it, which means you get close to instant sort of things happening. The other way is polling. So if the webhooks stop working or a system doesn't support it, Zapier will say, okay, well, I'll go ask it every 5 minutes to get a list of like the latest stuff. And if the latest stuff has changed since the last time, then I can sort of pretend there are triggers. You know, I can make a list of things, events, essentially based on that. And the actions are just API calls. You know, it's a typical Zapier thing will have actions for creating stuff and for finding stuff. There's not so much updating or doing minor edits. It's not intended to build integrations. You're not supposed to try and synchronize 2 different things. It's much more kind of pushing stuff from one system to the other, and then what happens afterward is not Zapier's concern. It doesn't want to copy stuff backward. That's not its focus. So Zapier hosts all of this glue code that sort of glues the different systems together. It's fairly clever. So Zapier sits on a cloud. And SuperOffice sits on a cloud. Different one. Mogensen also has a cloud. And you have a cloud. And you have a cloud. Everybody has a cloud. We write some JavaScript, a Node.js app, that converts SuperOffice APIs into Zapier constructs. Actually. And MailChimp has done a similar job for its APIs. And the clever thing is that our integration code and Node's, or MailChimp's integration code, both live inside Zapier's cloud. They're not relying on our cloud kind of being the place that runs this code. They keep all this code kind of in their data center. And so this lets them say, okay, you convert your stuff to our format, and then we can convert that, push that data through to any of the other apps on the other side. So this makes this makes the whole Zapier in the center kind of work. So I'm going to talk about how we built our little Node.js application. And they used to have a GUI for doing this, and you can imagine all the fun of trying to do integration logic in a web page. So they kind of decided that that was a good first try, but now we should do real programming. So they've said, okay, we'll do Node.js, and you download what they call their platform, the Zapier platform, and then you can sort of write a bunch of code and use their platform to upload your code to their cloud, and they'll host it and take care of versioning for you and all that kind of stuff. So you say basically you get a little command line that you download, and then you say Zapier init, name of your application, and it fills in a little file with a bunch of example code for you. And all the stuff is up on GitHub, so you can go look at it there. But the key thing in Zapier is that you don't run so much directly. It's much more, you declare a bunch of properties in a big object. So you have app. Let's see if it works this way. Nope. There we go. Yep, up there. App. And they have some versions, and then you have triggers, searches, and creates. And those are objects with a bunch of properties with a sort of dictionary saying, here's my name of this property, and then another object. And recipe here is another object with a whole bunch of different properties on it, declaring what functions to call and so on. And it nests quite deeply. But it's a fairly simple structure. But before we can do anything, we first have to do login. So one of the chunks in the declaration there is how do you connect to how do you authenticate? And lucky for us, the online team got OAuth 2 working, just in time for us to start using it. So that was fun, being part of the debugging of OAuth. But you can see here we say, okay, we do OAuth 2 configuration, and the way you kick off the authorization process is you go to this URL, and the URL is defined or the base URL is defined in a config setting, and then stick OAuth authorize on the end of it. And that'll kind of start off the OAuth 2 process. And then there's 2 functions. So get access token function and a refresh access token function. So in OAuth, you have refresh tokens, which you use to sort of act as a private password for a long time. It sort of represents your identity. You have to keep it quite secret. And you never transmit that sort of in the clear, but you can use it to get an access token, which is a short-lived thing, but it'll sort of work as a password for you. And then we have auto refresh here, which basically tells Zapier that when you call SuperOffice, it says you don't have access, then you can use the refresh access token function automatically to get a new one, and then try again, essentially. You don't have to do any retry logic yourself. Zapier will take care of that for you. So that's quite nice. So there's our super ID URL. The super ID part is hidden inside the environment variable. And there's our function to get an access token, basically, from super ID. So what does that look like? Okay, so first time you do this, you get you get a bit of a user interface. The Zapier window will sort of go like, oh, open up and say, you need to first log in if you haven't logged in already. And if you've logged in, it'll say, oh, this application wants to talk to your database, please approve. And you say yes, and then finally this gets called. And so here, we can now go off and ask, we can do a post to all auth tokens, and say a whole bunch of secrets, our app ID and our app token and all that kind of stuff. We do that request, and then once that request comes back, we get our then handle the response. We need to get our certificate and do a parse, a decryption, essentially verify that the token that we got back is from SuperOffice, that it actually matches, it's been encrypted with the corresponding private key. So we have our public key from SuperOffice. If JWT verify comes back with sort of a JWT token, then we can pull out the different bits and pieces from that token. So we have our little access token, refresh token, but then we also have things like the URL, so the JWT token, and then blah, 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 long URL that says basically this is the address for the web API that you want to talk to. So then that means that's something the user doesn't have to tell us. We can get it from the claims. The CTX, that's the customer ID. That's useful for us because we can put that in the user interface and say, like, you are connected to customer 123. The associate ID is very useful. We want to know what your current user ID is. And subject. What's your username, as it were? So these are all these come from SuperID. We return them up to the Zapier system, and Zapier kind of sticks them in an object for us, so we can get them later on. So, but this function essentially gets called by Zapier when it sort of is as part of the login flow for us. There we go. That's verify. Gotta remember these. So then, okay, so at this point we have our access token, so we can talk to the API. And we have the URL for the API because we got that out of the token also. And so now we need to connect to SuperOffice. We want to say, okay, we want to set up a trigger, a webhook. And so webhooks come in two forms. There's kind of the way things started with static webhooks. So in a static webhook, the system that you're trying to integrate with will generate some sort of URL for you, and you copy and paste that into Zapier or some other system. Saying like, this is where you should send your events. And it's manual, and it requires a bunch of work on the user's part. And it was a way webhooks kind of got started, but after a while people discovered like, oh, that's really hard and complicated, and people get confused. So maybe we should do it programmatically instead. And so Zapier and a bunch of others kind of said like, we should use this thing called REST hooks, or the REST hook pattern. And so basically they defined a little API or a convention. Essentially, it's not a strictly defined protocol. It's just sort of, you should support these things, and then others can program against it and set up webhooks automatically. So SuperOffice supports this. So we have a webhook endpoint that you can get a list of the webhooks that are in the system. You can add your own with a post. You can update them, and you can delete them. And Zapier will take care of the other part, which is generating the URL that you're supposed to send information to. So when you set up a trigger in Zapier, it'll generate kind of this long random URL for us, and then call SuperOffice and say, please call me on this URL whenever something happens to contacts, for example. So this is how this happens. Here we're defining basically the trigger. So we say when the company is created, and describe like trigger when a new company is created. And then the operation part here defines, okay, how should this work, you know? And this is a webhook. So there's a webhook type. And there's a method that says, do the subscription. Set it, register this new webhook for us with this function, subscribe webhook. And then there's a corresponding one, unsubscribe, of course, when we want to take away a webhook. And then when the webhook arrives, call this function. So this is all declarative programming, essentially, saying like when this happens, call this function. When this other thing happens. And then there's a whole bunch of other things which it also requires. So this is the setup the webhook function. It says the top chunk here is the data. This is the how does a webhook get registered in SuperOffice. We have a thing called the target URL, like where should the webhook deliver its information, and that comes from Zapier. Zapier defines this bundle of information for us, and target URL is one of them. So that gets Zapier generates a URL and tells us that. And then for company created, there's an event called contact.created. So that's, and this is a type webhook. We haven't defined any other types yet, but you never know. We can get creative, we can come up with other event mechanisms. And then there's a bunch of options for how do we want to register this. Like this is the HTTP options, essentially. And here we're saying post this chunk of data to the web API, the SuperOffice web API, webhook endpoint. So post means create a new one, and it's a JSON object, so please, use content type JSON. And then finally, it sort of sends all this off, and then it doesn't have to do very much else. It just returns yes, that works. So that's, at this point, we now have told SuperOffice, like, please call us whenever contact created happens at this Zapier URL. All with me so far? Or like, no? No. Beefy. Okay, so now something happens. As you click this in the Zapier UI, it'll, you go step through the wizard, and it eventually comes to sort of show you some data. Like, here's a preview of some data for, like, we have tested the webhook, and this is what you can expect to find. Of course, what happens in reality is there's a bunch of logic, a bunch of processing happening behind the scenes there. When the webhook actually arrives, it looks like this. And that's not like what we see over here, which is a lot smaller and nicely formatted. So the wild webhook, when it arrives, it's very secure. There's very little information in it, but it's very safe. So basically, you get the event name. So what just happened? What did it happen to? And a list of things which changed. So in a create, it's basically a list of all the fields on the table. When it's an update, it's a list of what fields changed during that particular update. But it doesn't tell you what they changed to. There's no information there. So that's not so useful. So what we need to do then is webhook comes in from SuperOffice, and then we have to go get the information. It's like, oh great, contact 123, was created. Lovely. I have to go get contact 123. But that's very safe because that's protected by access tokens and so on. So we can't get that information without being properly authorized. Whereas if a webhook goes to the wrong address, is registered the wrong thing or is intercepted on the way or something, there's not much you can't do anything with it. It's like, oh, lovely, they've created a new record, but there's no secret information in there. So it's quite safe. But that means we have to do a bit more extra work when we're processing these things. So we have to go get the contact information. And because we want to also expose user-defined fields in a nice way, we have to go get the user-defined field layout that defines what the different fields are labeled and what types they are, and so on. And then we sort of massage the data a little bit and make it all nice and pretty. And then we can send that finished, clean structure into the rest of the Zapier. And we return that to Zapier and say, like, okay, great, here's the contact. Use that in the rest of the workflow. So to get from that over to kind of the nice, pretty Zapier structured fields, we have to do a bunch of work. So we start off with basically just the primary key. That's the one piece of information we get basically from the webhook, like the ID. So we get that out of the webhook, and then we call another function that says, okay, go get this. So we call the get one contact for us, please. And it does get on the web API, contact, and then sticks the ID in there. And then that eventually comes back to us. We parse out the contact information. But again, that contact information is not quite suitable for human consumption. It's got a whole bunch of stuff in there, like, has all the table rights and field rights and things like that. And those aren't things that people care about. That is, the field rights on the department field are not interesting to you when you're building Zip. I don't think. If you can come up with a good use case for it, I'd love to hear it. But we then say, take that contact, go get the user-defined field layout, and then take all of that information and clean it up essentially. The view contact does this basically. It makes a new blank object and then copies just the bits of information that we want into kind of the new blank object and returns that. And that is the kind of the thing that finally shows up in the Zapier UI.
It's only the current state of the report.
No. Well, the report data is gone. So the before state is no more. The event has happened. So there is no before. And then in terms of a created event, the before was nothing. So there was nothing, and now there is something. And sticking an extra null in there is not helping anyone. So actions. These are just API calls, essentially. So we have the action create a company. That is essentially just post to API contact. Create person is post to API person, and so on. So, and the action basically defines it's a bunch of input fields, different types for those, and then a bunch of output fields. That means after this action, you can take this information and process it all, further. So after create, the company ID is now suddenly a known value, but that's not an input field. We don't ask you to input the ID. We know it's good. We don't know it yet. So the input fields and the output fields could be slightly different, or quite different, depending on what you want to do. But Zapier kind of does encourage people, like, do creates, don't do updates. Updates are hard. Because that usually entails finding one thing and then changing something on it. And then doing that change will probably trigger something else, and then it's like, all hell breaks loose. So to define the set of input fields and so on, like building the UI in Zapier, is you basically define a list, a collection of the fields, what they should look like, what types they have. There's a whole bunch of other properties on there. But we have, a type string. That's fairly easy, right? You get an input field. But then we have things like the drop-downs, where we have lists of things. And so we can put another property on there where it says, okay, what list should you go ask us? And there's different ones, so category, business, all these things. And so when we get to the actual, we'll come back to the list in a bit. When we come to the actual creating, like all the fields that we defined have been filled out, or some of them have been filled out, some of them are left blank. But then the actual doing of the creating is again another function. It's another function that Zapier calls when it's time. So it passes in a bundle which has a bunch of input data on it. So business ID, it's a number, and what we do first is we go get a default object out of SuperOffice API. So that's the first call there. And then we take that blank object and we fill in all the different fields on it. So response.businessID is filling out the SuperOffice object. And then we just fill in the number that you chose or have passed in the Zapier user interface. And then, for example, email. We have just one string field on for email in the Zapier UI. But of course, in the SuperOffice object, it's an array. So we say, okay, we'll push a new object on there, and we have a value property on it with the email address that you filled in. And then here, the lovely street address, the lovely structured addresses, yay. And then finally, we do a bunch of UDEF processing, like user-defined fields are added to the input fields. Those need to be pulled into the right places. And then finally, we can take the completed object and post it to URL v1 contact, and that will create a new company for us. The drop-down lists, well, actually, before we, so does that make sense? Like, it's not that hard. So for the places in the user interface, we have drop-down lists like business and category. Zapier calls these triggers for some bizarre reason. But basically, they are functions that get called and say, when we have a category, use the MDO category trigger, use the ID and name fields to populate this list, basically. And similarly, company name, there's an MDO contact list that we can use, and there's an ID and name. And the MDO category and MDO contact are names defined in the Zapier app. And so what happens is then, eventually the function here gets called and says like, okay, populate the list. So when in the Zapier UI, when you drop down the list here, it'll put up a little funny message about carrier pigeons being released. And what it's doing behind the scenes is it's actually calling this function. And it's kind of entertaining you while this function does its work. So what we do is we go off and ask the MDO list provider system, like, can you give us the list of contacts in a nice flattened list? We don't want a hierarchy. And then return map the list of responses into something suitable. Similarly for category and business and all the other different systems. And here you see it says item.id and item.name. Those get copied sort of from different case versions. But this is essentially constructing a little object that matches kind of what Zapier expects. And then that is what Zapier kind of goes like, oh, okay, I can populate the drop-down list with these items. And then you can pick. And it knows, because we said, here we said id.name. And here also, and ID and name. So it knows, okay, we want the ID, the number field, to be the actual value, but what we're going to show in the list is the name property. And so that's the name property here. And finally, searching. When we go searching, we'll usually have some information, from another system. Like if you've done a Twitter lookup or something, and it's like, oh, I have something that looks like a person name or a company name or something. That's not something I can use to create a properly linked appointment or something. In SuperOffice, I have to do a bit more lookup. I have to get some more information out of SuperOffice first. And so we did a search function which had a whole bunch of different fields. You can do complex searches, search on name and category and email address all at the same time. It was very complex, or it supported very complex search behavior, and it didn't work at all. It turns out that if you can define mappings or sort of fill these big things in with, for example, values from a spreadsheet. You can say, oh, when somebody adds a row to the spreadsheet, do a search for the corresponding values. Turns out if you have blank values in the spreadsheet, then you get weird values filled in. Like Zapier decides that, oh no, this one's null, and we'll just leave some garbage in there. So you end up with searches not returning anything at all. And it turns out, like almost all the other systems out there, they've also gone for this pattern where basically you choose what field you want to search on in first, and then you provide kind of a search value as one string. And that's all you get basically. You don't get to provide a complex set of criteria. It's like, no, you have a unique field or something, and you better find some way to get that match. So the drop-down list for companies, for example, is like company ID, company name, email address, number, VAT number or code, or any of the user-defined fields that are indexed. But of course, and this is also, it's a lot easier to use. So, that's what people need. That's not what programmers think like. But then to actually do the search, we go off and we do a query against the OData endpoint. Go ask you want contact. And then based on what you chose, we'll create a different sort of filter query. If you search for contact ID, you can type in the number. Search by name, then it's like, okay, name equal, and then whatever you type. Search an email address, then, okay, we're going to go search on the email address and do that. And then that turns into the $filter query. And then finally, we do the search. And then the first result that gets back, we take that number or that ID, and we go get the actual record. And that means we'll do a get, essentially, and like go get record 13, whatever it is that match. So the search result is like basically take the first answer we get, take the first match. No one is watching, like there's no user kind of sitting monitoring this stuff, so we can't offer a choice of items. That doesn't make any sense. It's like you get nothing or you get the first best match. And then we do a get, so that you get the same output fields out of this operation as you would from a trigger or from a create. You get all of the fields on that object as output of this operation. the input is like just one email address or one name. And the output is like, okay, here are all the fields of the contact. Make sense? No? It's not terribly hard. Right? It's these three things. We can get one thing, we can create new things, or we can go look for things. And so in the initial Zap, it's like we have for companies and for persons and for sale. Yeah, or unique-ish. The search fields, well, they're not truly unique. Things like email address, for example, or URL are, they're not guaranteed unique, but they will probably be a close match. Yeah, well then, does it matter which one you get? Well then, maybe Zapier is not for you. Or you need to make your own Zapier app that does that particular thing. No. At least not sort of as far as I know. Zapier has functions for kind of doing a little bit of manipulation here and there, but not sort of taking lists of things and processing them, doing that. It's not, Zapier's initial recommendation is like, no more than 5 triggers and 5 actions. Like basically 5 is kind of their upper limit, and shipping with 7 or 8.
One of the guys asked to try to implement one of the things we've done, broadcasting information for a customer, none were, we were not able to do any of them. For instance, warn if somebody makes an activity of my contact. That's impossible to do. There aren't any triggers of activities, so no way of saying who's my contact from.
Yes, I think what we are seeing here is maybe a meeting of 2 cultures. One culture that says, oh, whatever happens, post it on Slack. Send something on MailChimp and that's an integration. And on the other hand, you have this corporate thing, which says where we have this fairly complicated business process that takes a bunch of conditions at every step and then does a number of more or less complicated things, and that's an integration. And Zapier, I would say, is in the first camp, but moving towards the second camp. With this thing, you have the paths, you have multiple choices, and so on. So it's moving towards allowing more logic. And we are just beginning to explore what Zapier can and cannot do. And I'm pretty sure that a year from now, we're going to have a Zapier presentation, and it's going to show probably a bit more, but I'm not going to predict what and how much, because that depends on finding out what's the sweet spot. What is it that Zapier is good for, and what do we need to do to make it perfect for a reasonable set of use cases? So we're just exploring. So nag us, tell us, make us app that resends empty or text is not empty, which kind of breaks the process. Now, the device IDs in particular tend to contain 00 somewhere in that string. And for my demo, that was enough. To make it really work, not quite. So this is one of those cases where it works for a demo, it needs a little bit more work. And in this case, it's Zapier that needs a little bit more work. Their string search is not good enough for my case. Someone should make a note of that. Someone is making a note. Now, my action is I do a post. Oh, this is the interesting part. into the particle cloud. So I'm coming from the SuperOffice cloud, using the Zapier cloud, and I'm posting to the particle cloud, particle being the company that makes these little gizmos, and they have a big cloud ecosystem behind it, which is the actual value. You know, you can buy an Arduino from anyone. But with a cloud ecosystem behind it, it becomes worth a lot more. They do all the finicky stuff with public-private keys and access tokens and making sure it's my device and not your device, and it's that one and not this one. And on the device, in the C code, I can say, expose the function DG register. And simply by doing that, there appears in the particle cloud a place I can call API particle IO, V1, devices, the device ID. I could send a more complex payload because I can just say semicolon, step 1, company name, semicolon, step 1, you know, blah, blah, blah. Parse it down there and show on the screen that you belong to customer something. Cool effect, you know, you open your drain and there's your name on it. You know that everything is set up correctly. So that's going from SuperOffice. Going the other way, high water alert. Again, particle has its magic. In the firmware, in the C code, I say publish event high water. And what happens is I can then go into the particle cloud, which has a similar setup to Zapier, actually. And when this event happens, you should do something. In particular, they call it an integration, and you can do several different things. You can connect directly to Azure IoT. They have specific integrations for that. They have an if this then that integration, not Zapier directly, natively, which is stupid of them. But you can also do a webhook if you want to. And I want to. And the way I set it up is in Zapier, I catch the hook, which actually means Zapier sets up an endpoint, which is a complicated URL. So Zapier tells me, you need to call this place. And this is not something you can guess, hopefully. So this is what I paste into the particle cloud thing, telling when the device triggers this event, dear particle, go and call this with a certain payload. And then my Zap goes and does a find contact. Search criteria, again, that's the UDEF field name. It needs to be an indexed UDEF field, so that cost me about 5 minutes of, Christian, get your headphones off, it's not working. And here I had valid sample data when I was setting it up. So this is actually the device ID. So that's how I go and find my contact. Next thing I do, because I am on the development version, I create request. 1 week ago, I couldn't do that. So I have a different setup saying create appointment, which would have worked almost as well in the demo. I mean, it doesn't really matter for the sake of the demo. But so one of you asked what's coming. Sooner or later, we're going to release this version, which includes create request and trigger on request created. And so the request title, as you see, it's a combination of fixed string text and fields, and that's from step 1. That's the payload coming from the device. It's a measurement. It's how many centimeters are left to the maximum level. So that's something, when the device triggers the event, it can send along a string payload. And we've carried that all the way to here. Then I need to connect it.
Not in the format.
it's in the JSON payload that's sent with the hook from Particle. If you have time and the inclination, I can log on to the Particle cloud and show you what it looks like there. And so I need to connect the request to the correct contact, the correct customer. And so here you see I'm taking from step 2, which was the find contact. I'm extracting the contact ID. And there's not much more to do in this case because I'm satisfied. This is enough. I'd probably have a category. I might perhaps use the payload to map to a priority, depending on how quickly the water is filling up. But I would say don't do that here. That's probably something that properly belongs in a CRM script because it's part of your service logic. You know, this is a gold customer and there's a lot of water coming in, so we're escalating it directly. That's the kind of logic that you probably don't want in Zapier, and you certainly don't want it in the device because that's quite far away and quite hard to upgrade. And so that's the end of it. And to close the loop, to get the confirmation, I made another Zap, which triggers on the creation of the request. It finds the contact because it needs the device ID from the contact. And then it does the post to the Particle cloud, which triggers, and it's a different post. It's not the DG register. This one is DG confirm. So it goes to a different endpoint inside the device and causes the LEDs to flash green and yellow or green and nothing. And so that closes the loop, and it's interesting because it's actual proof that the device managed to create the ticket, and the ticket was then confirmed back to the device. Whether that's something you actually need, test in the Zapier filter wizard thing. I guess they just never had the use case. So we should ask them. Yep. Regular expression would be extremely powerful. I think Zapier is targeting an audience that does not really work with regular expressions. That's my reading of where they are in the market. Certainly we as developers would think that that's a nice hammer.
All right, there is a bug in the agenda. So the agenda says we should go for another 50 minutes and then start immediately on the next session. Can you guess what the bug is? We are done now. So thank you very much all for coming, and you now get a 15-minute break.